What happens when an apex predator species discovers they're not alone in the universe? What happens when that species is humanity and they're angrier than anyone imagined? This is the confession of Zexahai Mordoon, a Kytherian war-caste soldier who survived first contact with the species the galaxy now whispers about in terror. His memories, extracted from classified military debriefs, reveal the truth behind humanity's explosive entrance into galactic civilization. This is not a story of heroic conquest or noble warfare. This is a nightmare told by someone who lived through humanity's awakening and barely survived to remember it. The memory extraction chamber hummed with a low, ominous frequency that seemed to burrow into my very bones. As I lay strapped to the neural interface table, I could feel the cold metal probes sliding into the base of my skull, seeking the pathways to memories I had spent 3 cycles trying to forget. The Kytherian High Command wanted every detail of what happened at Kepler 42b. They wanted to know how an entire battle fleet, my battle fleet, had been reduced to burning wreckage by a species we had never heard of before that day. My name is Zexahai Mordoon, formerly battle commander of the 7th Kytherian Assault Legion. I say formerly because after what happened in the Kepler system, there was no legion left to command. Of the 12,000 warriors under my authority, fewer than 300 survived. Those of us who did make it back were broken, shell-shocked remnants of what we once were. Some had lost their minds entirely, babbling about creatures that moved like liquid death and fought with a fury that defied all understanding of warfare. But I remember everything. Every horrible, impossible moment of our first encounter with humanity. The Kytherian Empire had been expanding for over 2 millennia. We were the apex military force in our sector of the galaxy, a civilization built on conquest and the subjugation of lesser species. Our warriors stood 3 meters tall, with natural armor plating that could deflect most energy weapons and physical strength that could crush durasteel with bare hands. We had conquered 47 different worlds, each populated by species that had seemed formidable until they met us. We were proud. We were invincible. We were fools. The mission briefing had seemed routine. Our long-range scouts had detected signs of industrial civilization on the 3rd planet of the Kepler 442 system. Electromagnetic emissions, atmospheric pollution, primitive nuclear technology, all the hallmarks of a species just beginning to reach beyond their homeworld. Intelligence estimated their technological level at roughly Category 3, meaning they had basic spaceflight but no faster-than-light capability and no energy shielding worth mentioning. Standard procedure was simple: arrival, demonstration of superior firepower, demand for surrender, followed by either peaceful annexation or swift conquest depending on their response. We had done it dozens of times before. Even the most stubborn species rarely resisted for more than a few planetary rotations once they saw our ships blotting out their skies. Admiral Vexthul Korgan, my commanding officer, had been positively bored during the final briefing. "Another primitive world," he had grumbled, his massive form barely fitting in the command chair. "Mark my words, Mordoon, they'll surrender before we even need to fire a shot. These young species always do once they see what real power looks like." How terribly wrong we were. The journey to the Kepler system took us through 17 different hyperspace jumps, each one bringing us closer to what we thought would be another easy victory. Our battle fleet was impressive even by Kytherian standards. 43 heavy assault cruisers, each one carrying a full complement of warriors and enough firepower to reduce a continent to molten glass. My own flagship, the Burning Vengeance, was a magnificent example of Kytherian military engineering. 2 kilometers of armored death bristling with plasma cannons and particle beam arrays. We dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system with all the ceremony and intimidation that military doctrine demanded. Our ships arranged themselves in the traditional conquest formation, a display meant to showcase our overwhelming numerical and technological superiority. Within moments, our communications officers were broadcasting the standard ultimatum in what our linguistic computers had determined was the dominant language of the planet's inhabitants. The response we received was unlike anything in our military archives. Instead of the expected pleas for mercy or desperate attempts at negotiation, we heard something that chilled even our battle-hardened hearts. Laughter. Not the laughter of madness or despair that we had occasionally encountered from doomed species, but something far more unsettling. It was the laughter of someone who had just been told a particularly amusing joke. "Unknown vessels," came the transmission from the planet's surface, spoken in what seemed to be a surprisingly calm voice. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Earth Defense Force. I have to admit, your timing is absolutely perfect. We've been expecting someone like you for quite some time now." Admiral Corgan's confusion was evident in the way his crest spines flared. Impossible. Our scouts detected no evidence of extraterrestrial contact. Dumb end. The human voice continued, still carrying that disturbing tone of amusement. "Oh, we've been watching the galaxy for longer than you might think. We know about your empire, your conquest patterns, your tactical preferences. We've been studying you, learning from every species you've subjugated. And now we get to put that education to use." Our tactical displays suddenly lit up with new contacts. Ships were emerging from what appeared to be empty space throughout the system, their stealth capabilities so advanced that our sensors had completely failed to detect them. But these weren't the primitive vessels we had expected. These ships were sleek, predatory things that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their design was utterly alien to us, not the bulky, heavily armored constructs that most species favored, but lean, sharp-edged craft that looked more like weapons than ships. "Impossible," Admiral Corgan breathed. "How many ships are there?" Our sensor operator, a young warrior named Fexville, was frantically working his controls. "Admiral, I'm reading. This can't be correct. I'm showing over 200 contacts and the number keeps climbing. But it wasn't just the number of ships that shocked us. It was their behavior. Instead of arranging themselves in defensive formations around their world, as any sane species would do when facing a superior force, these human ships were spreading out through the system in complex patterns. Some were moving toward our fleet with unsettling speed, while others were taking positions that would allow them to attack us from multiple angles simultaneously. "They're trying to surround us," I realized, my training finally overcoming my shock. "Admiral, we need to—" The first human attack came without warning, without the traditional exchange of ultimatums that civilized warfare demanded. One moment, our sensors showed the human ships maintaining what appeared to be a respectful distance. The next moment, the space around our fleet erupted in a hellstorm of weapons fire unlike anything in our experience. The humans didn't use energy weapons as we understood them. Instead, they launched what appeared to be simple kinetic projectiles, chunks of metal accelerated to incredible velocities. Our defensive systems, designed to stop plasma bolts and particle beams, were utterly inadequate against solid matter moving at significant fractions of light speed. The first salvo punched through our shields as if they weren't there and tore into our hull armor with devastating effect. The Iron Fist, one of our heaviest cruisers, simply disintegrated under the impact of dozens of these projectiles. We died in an instant, reduced to vapor along with their ship. "Return fire!" Admiral Corgan roared. "All ships, engage at will!" Our response was everything military doctrine demanded: coordinated, overwhelming, and precise. 42 remaining ships unleashed their full firepower at the approaching human vessels. The space between our fleets became a blazing inferno of energy discharges that should have vaporized anything in their path. The humans didn't even slow down. Their ships moved through our weapons fire with an agility that defied physics as we understood it. They twisted and rolled and accelerated in ways that should have turned their crews into paste from the gravitational forces involved. Yet they kept coming, kept firing those impossible kinetic weapons that our defenses couldn't stop. How are they moving like that? Fexville screamed over the chaos of battle. The acceleration forces alone should be killing them. I was beginning to understand that everything we thought we knew about these creatures was wrong. Maybe they don't have crews, I suggested. Maybe they're automated vessels. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. No artificial intelligence could adapt and respond to changing battle conditions with the creativity these ships were displaying. These vessels were definitely being piloted by living beings, but living beings that could somehow withstand forces that would liquefy any Kytherian warrior. The battle continued to deteriorate with shocking speed. Our ships, massive and heavily armored as they were, simply couldn't match the speed and maneuverability of the human vessels. We were like ancient siege towers trying to fight against flying cavalry. Every time we tried to bring our superior firepower to bear, the humans would dart away, reposition themselves, and strike us from a completely different angle. But it was the humans' tactics that truly terrified me. They weren't just fighting to win. They were fighting to send a message. They targeted our weapon systems with surgical precision, crippling our ability to fight back without destroying us outright. They wanted us alive, wanted us to experience the helplessness of being completely outmatched. "Admiral!" My communications officer's voice cracked with panic. "I'm receiving a transmission from the humans. They want to talk." Admiral Corgan's proud bearing had already begun to crumble under the reality of our situation. "Put him through." The same calm voice from earlier filled our bridge. "Admiral Corgan, this is Admiral Chen again. I think we've demonstrated our capabilities sufficiently. Are you ready to discuss terms?" Terms? Corgan's voice was thick with humiliation. What terms could there possibly be? "You've made it clear that you can destroy us at will." "Oh, we're not going to destroy you," Admiral Chen replied, and somehow her reasonable tone made her words even more chilling. "You're going to go home. You're going to tell your high command exactly what happened here. You're going to make it very clear that Earth is not interested in joining your empire, and that any future attempts at conquest will be met with considerably less restraint than we've shown today." I watched our tactical display as more and more of our ships fell silent, their weapons systems systematically disabled by the humans' precise fire. We had begun this battle with overwhelming superiority in numbers, firepower, and experience. Now we were helpless, completely at the mercy of a species we had dismissed as primitive. "There's something else you should know," Admiral Chen continued. "We've been monitoring your communications since you entered our system. We know where you came from, and we know about every world you've conquered in the past 50 years. We've been in contact with several of those species, and they're very interested in discussing their liberation." The full implications of her words hit me like a physical blow. The humans weren't just defending their world, they were threatening the foundation of our entire empire. They had somehow developed not only superior military technology, but also intelligence-gathering capabilities that had allowed them to spy on us without our knowledge. "You're threatening war against the entire Kytherian Empire," Admiral Corgan said, his voice barely controlled. "You have no idea what forces you would be facing." "Actually, we know exactly what we'd be facing," came the reply. "And frankly, Admiral, after today's demonstration, are you really confident that your empire could handle us?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Looking around our bridge, seeing the fear in the eyes of warriors who had never known defeat, I realized that the answer was obvious to everyone present. We couldn't handle them. We couldn't even begin to handle them. As if to emphasize the point, several more of our ships reported critical systems failures. The humans were continuing their systematic dismantling of our fleet even while negotiating, demonstrating their complete control over the situation. "What do you want from us?" Admiral Corgan finally asked, his voice defeated. "Simple. Go home. Spread the word that humanity is not to be trifled with. And tell your high command that they have exactly 1 standard year to begin withdrawing from the worlds they've conquered. After that will come calling." The transmission ended, leaving us in stunned silence. Around us, the human ships had formed a perfect sphere, holding us in place without actually threatening immediate destruction. It was a display of power far more intimidating than any weapons demonstration could have been. We limped home with barely a quarter of our original force, our ships heavily damaged and our pride utterly shattered. The journey back to Kytherian space gave us plenty of time to contemplate what had happened, but no amount of analysis could make sense of it. How had a species we had never heard of developed technology so far in advance of ours? How had they learned about our empire without us detecting their surveillance? And most frightening of all, how many other species like them were out there, waiting in the darkness of space for us to make the mistake of underestimating them? The humans had let us live, but they had killed something far more important than our bodies. They had killed our certainty, our sense of superiority, our belief that the Kytherian Empire was the apex of galactic civilization. In its place, they had left us with the terrible knowledge that we were not the predators we thought we were. We were prey. The return journey to Kytherian Prime was a nightmare of anticipation and dread. Our once proud battle fleet now resembled a collection of damaged scrap metal limping through space, our hull breaches hastily patched and our weapon systems offline. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the psychological wounds we carried. Every warrior aboard our ships had been fundamentally changed by what we had witnessed. I spent most of the journey in my quarters trying to make sense of the tactical recordings from the battle. The more I studied the humans' movements and strategies, the more disturbing the implications became. These weren't the actions of a species that had just recently developed space warfare capabilities. Every maneuver, every tactical decision showed a level of sophistication that suggested centuries of military evolution and experience. But experience fighting whom? If the humans were as isolated as our intelligence had suggested, where had they learned to wage war with such devastating effectiveness? The answer came to me as I analyzed their communication intercepts. Admiral Chen had mentioned monitoring our communications and studying our conquest patterns. What if the humans hadn't been isolated at all? What if they had been watching, learning, preparing for this exact scenario for decades or even centuries? The thought sent chills through my nervous system. It implied a level of patience and strategic thinking that was completely alien to the Kytherian mindset. We conquered through overwhelming force and direct confrontation. The humans had conquered us through preparation, intelligence, and the willingness to wait for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. When we finally reached Kytherian space, our reception was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Word of our defeat had somehow preceded us, spreading through the Empire's communication networks faster than our damaged ships could travel. Crowds of civilians gathered at every space station and orbital facility we passed, staring in silence at the remnants of what had once been considered an invincible military force. The High Command's reaction was swift and predictable. Within hours of our arrival at Kytherian Prime, Admiral Corgan and I were summoned before the War Council to provide a detailed account of our encounter with humanity. The council chamber, carved from a single massive crystal deep beneath the planet's surface, had witnessed the planning of countless successful campaigns. Now it would hear the story of our first true defeat. High Marshal Dex Ran Vortak, Supreme Commander of all Kytherian military forces, listened to our report in stone-faced silence. When we finished, he sat motionless for several minutes, his massive frame radiating the kind of controlled fury that preceded the most terrible decisions. "You're telling me," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that a single world, inhabited by a species we had never encountered before, completely destroyed one of our finest battle fleets?"
"Not destroyed, High Marshal," Admiral Corgan corrected carefully.
"They could have destroyed us completely. Instead, they chose to disable us and send us home with a message. A message of war," growled Warcast Commander Zethal Morkai. "This human admiral threatened the entire empire. Such insolence cannot be tolerated." I found myself speaking before I could consider the wisdom of my words. "With respect, Commander, I don't think they were making threats. I think they were making promises." The silence that followed was deafening. Several council members' crest spines flared in aggressive displays, but High Marshal Vortak raised a hand for silence. "Explain, Battle Commander Mardoon." The humans demonstrated capabilities far beyond what our intelligence suggested was possible. They knew about our empire, our tactics, our conquest history. This wasn't a lucky victory by a desperate species fighting for survival. This was a carefully planned demonstration by a military force that has been preparing for this encounter for a very long time. Impossible, Warcast Commander Morkai snarled. No species could have developed such advanced technology in isolation. Our scouts would have detected signs of their expansion long ago, unless they didn't want to be detected, I replied. The human stealth capabilities were so advanced that our sensors couldn't track them even during active combat. If they've had that technology for any significant period, they could have been observing us for decades without our knowledge. High Marshal Vortak leaned forward in his chair. Are you suggesting that this human species has been spying on us? I'm suggesting something worse than that. I think they've been studying every species we've conquered, learning our tactics, understanding our weaknesses, preparing countermeasures. When Admiral Chen mentioned contacting the species we've subjugated, she wasn't making empty threats. She was revealing intelligence operations that have probably been ongoing for generations. The implications of my words settled over the council chamber like a toxic cloud. If I was right, then humanity represented something entirely unprecedented in Kytherian experience, an enemy that understood us better than we understood ourselves. Even if your analysis is correct, High Marshal Vortak said slowly, we cannot simply ignore this challenge to our authority. The Empire's strength depends on the perception of our invincibility. If word spreads that a single world successfully defied us, it could inspire rebellion throughout our territory. Word has already spread, Admiral Corgan said quietly. The humans made sure of that when they let us return home. Every species we've conquered will know that we can be defeated. Over the following days, reports began arriving from across the Empire that confirmed our worst fears. Several subjugated worlds had stopped responding to communications from the imperial government. Others were reporting unusual electromagnetic activity that suggested the construction of defensive installations. Most disturbing of all, our intelligence networks were detecting increased interstellar communication between conquered species that had previously been isolated from each other. The humans had apparently made good on their promise to contact our former enemies. High Marshal Vortak's response was characteristically direct and brutal. He ordered the mobilization of the Grand Fleet, a massive armada of over 300 ships that represented the combined military might of the Kytherian Empire. If the humans wanted war, he declared they would get war on a scale they couldn't possibly imagine. I requested a private audience with the High Marshal to express my concerns about this plan. His personal chambers were a monument to military success, decorated with trophies from dozens of conquered worlds and staffed by servants from species that had once dared to resist Kytherian rule. It was a potent reminder of our empire's power, but after facing the humans, it felt more like a museum of past victories than a promise of future ones. High Marshal, I began carefully, I believe a direct military response may be exactly what the humans are hoping for. Explain. Everything about their behavior suggests careful planning and preparation. They revealed themselves at precisely the moment when they were ready for a confrontation. They demonstrated superior technology while deliberately limiting the scope of the engagement. And they sent us home with information that would inevitably lead to exactly the kind of massive military response you're now planning. You think this is a trap? I think this is the opening move in a war they've been preparing to fight for a very long time. They've had time to study our military doctrine, understand our tactical preferences, and develop countermeasures for our standard approaches. When the Grand Fleet arrives in the Kepler system, they'll be walking into a situation the humans have specifically designed. High Marshal Vortak was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Battle Commander Morden, I understand your concerns. Your experience with these humans has given you insights that the rest of us lack. But you must understand the political realities we face. The Empire cannot survive if other species believe they can successfully defy us. What if defying us isn't their goal? I asked. What if they're trying to destroy us? The question hung in the air between us like a physical presence. For the first time since I had known him, High Marshal Vortak looked uncertain. "The Grand Fleet launches in 10 days, he said finally. "I'm assigning you as tactical advisor to the expedition. Your knowledge of human capabilities may prove invaluable." As I left his chambers, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were playing directly into the humans' hands. Everything about their behavior suggested a species that thought several moves ahead, that understood the psychological and political pressures that would drive our response. They had wounded our pride and challenged our authority in exactly the way that would guarantee a massive military response. The preparation for the Grand Fleet's departure was unlike anything in Cytherian history. Ships were recalled from patrol duties throughout the Empire, warriors were pulled from garrison assignments on conquered worlds, and the entire military-industrial complex was mobilized to support the largest military operation ever undertaken. But as I watched the massive armada assembling in orbit around Cytherian Prime, I couldn't help but notice the signs of strain. Many of the recalled ships showed evidence of hasty repairs and inadequate maintenance. The warriors reporting for duty included significant numbers of recent recruits with minimal combat experience. Most telling of all, several conquered worlds had required increased garrison forces to suppress growing unrest, further depleting our available military strength. The human strategy was already working. They had forced us to commit enormous resources to a single operation while simultaneously inspiring rebellion throughout our territory. Whether or not they could actually defeat the Grand Fleet in direct combat, they had already succeeded in weakening the Empire's overall strategic position. 3 days before our scheduled departure, intelligence reports began arriving that changed everything. Human ships had been detected in 7 different star systems, all of them locations where we had recently suppressed rebellions or established new garrison forces. These weren't the same sleek warships we had encountered at Kepler 442b, but something entirely different. Massive industrial vessels that appeared to be constructing orbital installations at an incredible pace. They're building shipyards, I realized as I studied the tactical reports. The humans aren't just preparing to defend their homeworld, they're establishing a permanent military presence throughout our territory. Admiral Vectal Morgan, the Grand Fleet's commanding officer, reviewed the reports with growing alarm. How is this possible? These facilities would require months of construction time, but our intelligence indicates they appeared almost overnight. Unless the construction crews weren't human, I suggested. Remember? They claimed to be in contact with the species we've conquered. What if they've been providing technology and expertise to our former enemies? The implications were staggering. If the humans had been secretly arming and organizing the species we had subjugated, then the Grand Fleet would be facing not just a single advanced civilization, but a coalition of enemies equipped with human technology and driven by decades of accumulated resentment against Cytherian rule. More reports continued to arrive over the following days, each one painting a more dire picture of our strategic situation. Human-designed weapons were appearing in the hands of rebel forces throughout the Empire. Previously isolated species were coordinating their activities with unprecedented sophistication. Most alarmingly, several of our garrison commanders reported that their local intelligence networks had been completely compromised, suggesting that human intelligence operations had been active in our territory far longer than anyone had suspected. "How long do you think they've been planning this?" Admiral Morgan asked during one of our strategic planning sessions. I had been thinking about that question constantly since our return from Kepler 442b. Based on the sophistication of their operations and the depth of their intelligence penetration, I'd estimate at least 50 years. Maybe longer. 50 years of preparation, he mused, and we never detected any sign of their activities. We weren't looking for signs, I pointed out. We assumed we were the apex predator in this region of the galaxy. We never considered that another species might be studying us, learning our weaknesses, preparing to challenge us. The night before the Grand Fleet's departure, I stood in the observation deck of my assigned flagship, looking out at the assembled armada. 317 ships, each one a masterpiece of Kytherian military engineering, each one crewed by elite warriors who had never known defeat. It was the most powerful military force our civilization had ever assembled. But as I watched the massive ships maneuvering in their final preparations for departure, all I could think about was the calm confidence in Admiral Chen's voice when she had spoken to us at Kepler 442b. She had sounded like someone who had already won, who was simply going through the motions of a contest whose outcome had been determined long before the first shot was fired. The humans had been preparing for this war for decades. They had studied our tactics, learned our weaknesses, and developed countermeasures for our standard strategies. They had secretly organized a coalition of our enemies and provided them with advanced technology. They had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded our own in almost every measurable category, and now they were waiting for us to arrive, with the largest fleet in Kytherian history, walking directly into whatever trap they had spent 50 years preparing. As the Grand Fleet began its journey toward what would either be our greatest victory or our final defeat, I couldn't escape the feeling that we were already too late. The war had begun decades ago, and we had never even realized we were fighting it. The humans had been patient, methodical, and thorough in their preparations, while we had been complacent in our assumption of superiority. The real question wasn't whether we could defeat them in the coming battle. The real question was whether they had already defeated us before the battle even began. The Grand Fleet's journey to the Kepler system took us through 12 hyperspace jumps over the course of 8 standard days. With each jump, more disturbing intelligence reports reached us from across the Empire. The rebellion that had begun as isolated incidents of unrest had evolved into coordinated uprisings on over 40 worlds. Human-supplied weapons and technology were appearing everywhere, and previously conquered species were demonstrating military capabilities they had never possessed before. But it was the psychological warfare that truly unnerved our forces. The humans had somehow obtained detailed records of every atrocity committed during our various conquests, and they were broadcasting these records throughout the galaxy. Species that had never heard of each other were learning about the systematic brutalities they had all suffered under Kytherian rule. The effect was to create a sense of shared grievance and common purpose among civilizations scattered across thousands of light years. Admiral Morgan spent most of the journey in emergency conferences with the High Command, trying to coordinate responses to crises that were erupting faster than our military could address them. Several core worlds were reporting civil unrest among their own populations as news of the Empire's defeat spread through unofficial channels. The myth of Kytherian invincibility was crumbling, and with it the foundation of our political system. "They're not just fighting us," Admiral Morgan confided to me during one of our private strategy sessions. "They're destroying the very concept of our empire. Even if we somehow manage to defeat their military forces, the political damage may be irreversible." I had been thinking the same thing as I analyzed the patterns of human activity across our territory. "This isn't how we understand warfare," I told him. "We fight battles to control territory and resources." The humans are fighting a war to control ideas and perceptions. They're trying to change how every species in the galaxy thinks about us. "Can ideas defeat battleships?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Ideas created our empire in the first place," I reminded him. "The belief that resistance was futile, that the Kytherian military was unstoppable, that submission was the only rational response to our power. Take away those ideas, and our empire becomes just a collection of worlds held together by diminishing force and growing resentment." As we approached the Kepler system for the second time in less than a month, our scout ships reported that the human defensive preparations had expanded far beyond what we had seen during my previous encounter. The space around Earth was now filled with orbital installations whose purpose our analysts couldn't determine. Massive construction projects were visible on the Moon and on several asteroids throughout the system. Most ominously, our sensors were detecting energy signatures that suggested weapons systems of unprecedented scale and power. But it was what we couldn't detect that worried me most. During my first encounter with the humans, their stealth capabilities had been so advanced that most of their fleet had remained invisible until they chose to reveal themselves. Now our sensors showed only a fraction of the installations and ships that were certainly present in the system. "How many ships do you think they actually have?" Admiral Morgan asked as we studied the tactical displays. "Unknown," I replied. "But based on their demonstrated capabilities, we should assume they have at least as many vessels as we do, possibly more." "That's impossible. Our intelligence indicates that Earth is a single world with a population of only a few billion. They couldn't possibly support a fleet the size of our Grand Fleet." I had been thinking about this apparent contradiction for days, unless they're not just using Earth's resources. Remember, they claim to have been in contact with dozens of species we've conquered. What if they've been coordinating industrial production across multiple worlds for decades? The implications were staggering. If the humans had indeed been secretly organizing a multi-species alliance, then they would have access to the combined industrial capacity of every world that had ever fallen under Catherian control. The resources required to build and maintain a fleet capable of challenging our empire would suddenly become entirely feasible. Our final approach to the Kepler system was conducted with all the ceremony and intimidation that Catherian military tradition demanded. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were performing for an audience that was no longer impressed by our displays of power. The Grand Fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, our ships arranged in the classical pattern designed to showcase our overwhelming numerical superiority. The human response was swift and utterly unexpected. Instead of the usual demands for surrender or attempts at negotiation, we received a simple message broadcast on all frequencies. "Welcome back, Admiral Morgan. We've been expecting you." Before anyone could respond to this greeting, our tactical displays lit up with new contacts. Ships were materializing throughout the system, not just around Earth but scattered across millions of kilometers of space in patterns that made no immediate tactical sense. But as more and more vessels appeared, the logic of their positioning became clear. They had surrounded us completely, creating overlapping fields of fire that would allow them to attack our fleet from every possible angle simultaneously. "How many ships are we looking at?" Admiral Morgan demanded. Our sensor operator, his voice tight with disbelief, reported the impossible numbers. "Admiral, I'm reading over 800 distinct contacts. The computer is still trying to classify them, but they appear to be using hull designs from at least 12 different species." 800 ships. The humans had not only matched our numerical strength, but had exceeded it by a factor of more than 2 to 1. And the diversity of ship designs suggested that my suspicions had been correct. This was not just a human fleet, but a coalition force representing multiple civilizations working together under human coordination. Admiral Morgan opened a communication channel to the entire Grand Fleet. "All ships, maintain formation and prepare for combat. We are facing a numerically superior enemy. But remember that quantity cannot substitute for the warrior spirit of the Catherian people." The response from the human fleet came in the form of a transmission that appeared on every screen throughout our armada. But instead of Admiral Chen's voice, we found ourselves looking at something that sent chills through every warrior present. A Catherian officer in full military regalia. "Greetings, Admiral Morgan," the figure said in perfect Catherian. "My name is Battle Commander Texville Morden, formerly of the 12th Assault Legion. I defected to the Human Alliance 6 months ago, along with over 3,000 of my fellow warriors." The shock of his words was like a physical blow. Catherian military personnel did not defect. Our loyalty conditioning was so thorough that the very concept of betraying the Empire was supposed to be psychologically impossible. "You're looking at representatives from 43 different species," the defector continued. "All of us former subjects of the Catherian Empire, all of us now working together under human leadership to build something better than the galaxy has ever seen. We're not here to destroy you, Admiral. We're here to offer you the same choice we were given. Join us, or be swept aside by the tide of history." Admiral Morgan's response was predictable and immediate. "All ships, Open fire. Show these traitors and their alien allies what real Kytherian warriors can do. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a systematic demonstration of technological and tactical superiority that made my previous encounter with the humans look like a minor skirmish. The Grand Fleet's opening salvo, the concentrated firepower of over 300 heavy warships, was absorbed by defensive systems that our sensors couldn't even properly analyze. Energy shields flickered and flared around the coalition vessels, but none of them took significant damage. The return fire was devastating and precise. Instead of trying to destroy our ships outright, the coalition forces targeted our weapon systems with surgical accuracy. Within the first few minutes of combat, over half of our vessels had been reduced to helpless hulks, their offensive capabilities completely neutralized, but their crews still alive. But it was the tactics that truly demonstrated the hopelessness of our situation. The coalition fleet moved as a single coordinated entity, with vessels from different species working together with a precision that suggested months or years of joint training. Human ships provided electronic warfare support that confused our targeting systems, while vessels designed by other species delivered devastating kinetic strikes or deployed exotic weapons that our databases couldn't identify. We're receiving surrender requests from 18 of our ships. Their commanders are requesting permission to stand down. This was unprecedented in Kytherian military history. Our warriors had been conditioned from birth to prefer death to surrender, yet they were voluntarily laying down their arms rather than continue a hopeless fight. "Denied!" Admiral Morgan roared. "All ships will continue fighting until their last breath." We are Kytherian warriors, not cowards. But even as he spoke, more ships were falling silent as their crews chose surrender over annihilation. The psychological impact of facing such overwhelming technological superiority was breaking down the conditioning that had defined Kytherian military culture for millennia. A new transmission appeared on our communication screens, this time showing Admiral Chen herself. Behind her, I could see what appeared to be a massive command center, staffed by beings from dozens of different species, all working together with obvious familiarity and mutual respect. "Admiral Morgan," she said calmly, "I think we've demonstrated our capabilities sufficiently. Your fleet is defeated. Your empire is in rebellion, and your military doctrine has been proven obsolete. The question now is whether you're wise enough to recognize reality and adapt to it. What are you proposing?" the Admiral asked, his voice hollow with defeat. "The same thing we've offered every species that's joined our alliance. Partnership instead of domination, cooperation instead of conquest, freedom instead of subjugation. Your people have skills and knowledge that could contribute enormously to our joint efforts to build a better galactic civilization. And if we refuse..." Admiral Chen's expression remained calm, but her words carried unmistakable steel. "Then you'll share the fate of every empire throughout history that refused to evolve with changing times. You'll become extinct, and the galaxy will move on without you." Around us, more and more Kytherian ships were surrendering. The sight of their crews being transported safely to coalition vessels rather than being executed as military doctrine would have demanded was having a profound psychological effect on those who were still fighting. These humans and their allies were demonstrating a concept that was alien to Kytherian thinking: mercy toward defeated enemies. "You're not just trying to defeat us militarily," I realized, speaking for the first time during the engagement. "You're trying to convert us." Every species that's ever joined our alliance started as an enemy. Some took longer to understand what we were offering than others, but eventually they all came to see that cooperation produces better results than domination. What about the species we've conquered? What about the worlds we've subjugated? Do they get a vote in this alliance of yours? "They already have voted," she replied. "That's why we're here. That's why your empire is collapsing. That's why over 800 ships are currently surrounding what's left of your Grand Fleet. The oppressed species of the galaxy have chosen freedom, and they've chosen to work with us to achieve it." As if to emphasize her point, our communication system suddenly filled with transmissions from across the empire. Conquered worlds were declaring their independence. Garrison commanders were reporting mass desertions, and civilian populations were rising up against their Kytherian overlords. The rebellion that had begun as scattered incidents had become a galaxy-wide revolution. "How long have you been planning this?" Admiral Morgan asked. "The planning began the day we first detected your expansion into this region of the galaxy," Admiral Chen replied. "We've had nearly 70 years to study your methods, understand your weaknesses, and prepare our response. We knew that eventually you would come for Earth, and we wanted to be ready when that day arrived." 70 years, an entire human lifetime dedicated to preparing for a war that they had always known was coming. The patience and long-term thinking required for such an undertaking was completely beyond Kytherian comprehension. We planned our conquests in terms of months or years, while the humans had been thinking in terms of generations. "What happens now?" I found myself asking. "Now you have the same choice that every species in our alliance has had to make?" Admiral Chen replied. "You can join us willingly and help us build something better than what came before, or you can cling to the old ways until they drag you down to extinction. But either way, the age of Kytherian domination is over." Looking around the bridge of our flagship, I saw the faces of warriors who had never known defeat, never questioned their superiority, never imagined that their empire could simply cease to exist. The shock of our complete tactical defeat was written in their expressions, but something else was beginning to replace it. Curiosity. For the first time in our history, we were seeing what the galaxy looked like from the perspective of the conquered rather than the conquerors. We were experiencing the helplessness that we had imposed on dozens of other species. And surprisingly, instead of the annihilation we would have delivered to any species that dared defy us, we were being offered something unprecedented, a second chance. The humans had not just defeated us militarily, they had defeated the very concept of empire based on domination and fear. They had shown us that there was another way to organize galactic civilization, a way based on cooperation and mutual benefit rather than conquest and subjugation. As more Kytherian ships surrendered and their crews were safely transported to coalition vessels, I began to understand that we were witnessing something far more significant than a military defeat. We were witnessing the birth of a new type of a galactic civilization, one that the humans had been patiently nurturing for 7 decades while we had remained blind to its growth. The aftermath of the Grand Fleet's defeat was unlike anything in recorded Kytherian history. Instead of being executed or enslaved as military doctrine would have dictated, the surrendering warriors were transported to what the humans called transition facilities, massive space stations where former enemies could learn about the alliance they were being invited to join. I found myself aboard the UES Harmony, a human-designed vessel that served as both a diplomatic center and a showcase of the Alliance's technological capabilities. The ship's corridors were filled with beings from dozens of different species, all of them former subjects of the Kytherian Empire, all of them now working together as equals in this unprecedented coalition. My escort was a female human named Dr. Lisa Park, a xenopsychologist who specialized in helping warrior cultures adapt to peaceful coexistence. She was smaller than any Kytherian, barely reaching the middle of my torso, yet she moved with a confidence that spoke of absolute security in her environment. "The hardest part for most Kytherian warriors," she explained as she led me through the ship, "is accepting that strength doesn't have to mean domination. Your people are naturally powerful and naturally aggressive, but those traits can be channeled into protection and construction instead of conquest and destruction." We passed through a recreational area where I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Kytherian warriors playing some kind of competitive game alongside beings from species we had once conquered. They were laughing together, competing with obvious enjoyment but without the lethal intensity that characterized all Kytherian interactions. "How is this possible?" I asked. "Those species should hate us. We destroyed their worlds, enslaved their populations, killed millions of their people." Park nodded gravely. Many of them do hate what the Catherian Empire did to them, but they've learned to separate their anger toward the system from their feelings about individual Catherians. Your people were as much victims of your own empire as anyone else, trapped in a culture that gave you no choice but to be conquerors. The concept was so alien to my understanding that I struggled to process it. We chose conquest. We gloried in it. How can you claim we were victims? Did you really choose it? She asked. Or were you conditioned from birth to believe that conquest was the only way to prove your worth? Were you given alternatives to consider, or was military service the only path to honor and respect in your society? Her questions forced me to confront aspects of Caitherian culture that I had never questioned before. We were indeed raised from childhood to see warfare as the highest calling, to measure our worth by our success in battle, to view other species as either subjects or enemies. The idea that there might be other ways to live, other sources of meaning and purpose, had simply never been presented to us. Come, Dr. Park said gently. There's someone I want you to meet. She led me to a quiet observation lounge where a figure sat alone, gazing out at the stars. As we approached, I recognized him as Battle Commander Texaval Morden, the defector whose transmission had shocked our fleet during the battle. Commander Morden, Dr. Park said, I'd like you to meet Battle Commander HFY Morden from the 7th Assault Legion. Texas Val turned to face me, and I was struck by how different he looked from any Caitherian warrior I had ever known. His bearing was still proud and strong, but there was something else in his expression, a sense of peace that I had never seen in any member of our species. Sit with me, brother, he said, using the informal term of address that Caitherian warriors only used among close comrades. Let me tell you about the day my eyes were opened. As I settled into the chair beside him, he began to speak in a voice that carried both pain and hope. 6 months ago, I was commanding a garrison force on Vectel Prime, one of the worlds we conquered 12 years ago. The local population had been completely pacified, or so I thought. Then the humans made contact. He paused, his gaze returning to the stars beyond the viewport. They didn't arrive with a fleet or issue ultimatums. Instead, they sent a single unarmed diplomatic vessel with a simple request. They wanted to show me something. What did they show you? I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. The truth about Vectel Prime. The humans had detailed records of our conquest, not just the military actions, but the civilian casualties, the cultural destruction, the systematic elimination of everything that had made the Vectel people unique. They showed me cities full of beings who had once created beautiful art and music and literature, reduced to silent workers in our industrial facilities. Wheelie said, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when they showed me what the Vectel could become if given the chance to rebuild their civilization. They had models and projections, plans for cities that combined the best of Vectel culture with advanced human technology. They showed me a future where my strength could be used to protect and nurture instead of dominate and destroy. Teddy. And you believed them? I didn't want to believe them, he admitted. Everything in my conditioning screamed that it was impossible, that they were trying to deceive me. So they did something that no enemy had ever done before. They gave me time to think about it. They left their plans and projections with me and said they would return in 1 month for my answer. Texas Val fell silent for a moment, and I could see him reliving those crucial weeks when his entire worldview had been challenged. I spent that month really looking at the world I was governing, he continued, not as a military administrator focused on order and productivity, but as someone trying to understand what we had done to these people. I talked to Vectel civilians, really listened to them for the first time. I learned about their history, their culture, their dreams for their children. What did you discover? I discovered that we hadn't conquered a world. We had murdered a civilization and built a factory on its corpse. The beings I was governing weren't grateful subjects who appreciated the order we had brought them. They were traumatized survivors who lived in constant fear that we might decide to eliminate them entirely. The pain in his voice was so raw that I found myself looking away. This was not how Kytherian warriors were supposed to think about conquest. We were taught to see ourselves as bringing order to chaos, strength to weakness, purpose to purposeless existence. When the humans returned, Texful continued, I was ready to listen to their proposal, not because I had suddenly become weak or sentimental, but because I had finally understood what real strength looked like. Real strength doesn't need to destroy everything different from itself. Real strength can lift others up instead of tearing them down. So you betrayed your oath to the Empire. He shook his head firmly. I honored my oath to protect and serve. I just finally understood who I was supposed to be protecting and serving. Not an empire built on fear and domination, but the people under my care who deserved a chance to rebuild what we had taken from them. Park, who had been listening silently to our conversation, spoke up. Commander Morden wasn't the only one. Over the past 6 months, we've had similar conversations with Kytherian officers throughout the Empire. Many of them have come to similar conclusions. How many? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Nearly 8,000 Kytherian military personnel have requested transfer to Alliance territory, she replied. They're working with their former enemies to undo the damage that the Empire inflicted and to build something better in its place. 8,000. That represented a significant fraction of the Empire's officer corps, the trained leaders who were essential to maintaining military discipline and effectiveness. If that many experienced commanders had defected, it explained why the rebellion was spreading so rapidly across our territory. What happened to your garrison on Vectel Prime? I asked Texivil. His face lit up with something I had never seen in a Kytherian warrior before. Genuine joy. They're building the most beautiful city you can imagine. Vectel architecture enhanced with human engineering, creating spaces that are both functional and artistic. My former soldiers are working as construction supervisors and security consultants, using their skills to protect the builders instead of oppressing them. And you're satisfied with this? You don't miss the glory of conquest? Brother, he said, placing a massive hand on my shoulder. There is no glory in conquest. There is only destruction disguised as achievement. But there is genuine glory in creation, in protection, in helping others become the best versions of themselves. I've experienced both, and I can tell you that what I'm doing now makes me prouder than any battle I ever won. Over the following days, Dr. Park arranged for me to meet with dozens of other former Kytherian warriors who had joined the Alliance. Each had their own story, their own moment of realization about what their empire had really been doing to the galaxy. But all of them shared the same sense of purpose and fulfillment that I had seen in Texivol. I also met with representatives from the species we had conquered, expecting to encounter hatred and demands for revenge. Instead, I found beings who were focused on the future rather than the past, who seemed genuinely interested in working with former enemies to build something unprecedented in galactic history. Don't you hate us? I asked a Vectel engineer who was showing me the plans for their reconstructed capital city. She considered the question carefully before responding. I hate what was done to my people. I hate the system that made such cruelty possible. But I don't hate you personally, because I can see that you're capable of becoming something different than what you were. How can you be so forgiving? Because forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, she replied. It's about choosing to build a different future. Hatred keeps us trapped in old patterns of violence and revenge. Forgiveness allows us to break those patterns and create something new. This philosophy was completely alien to Kytherian thinking, but I was beginning to see its practical value. The Alliance's success wasn't built on the temporary suppression of old grievances, but on the genuine transformation of former enemies into cooperative partners. As I learned more about how the Alliance functioned, I began to understand that the humans hadn't just defeated us militarily. They had invented an entirely new approach to galactic civilization. Instead of conquest and domination, they used diplomacy and mutual benefit. Instead of ruling through fear, they governed through consensus and shared purpose. How do you maintain order without the threat of force? I asked Admiral Chen during one of our conversations. "We don't maintain order," she replied. "We create it. When beings have a voice in determining the rules they live under, when they benefit from following those rules, when they can see that cooperation produces better results than conflict, order emerges naturally." "How do you deal with troublemakers?" "The same way we dealt with the Catherian Empire," she said with a slight smile. "We show them that there's a better way to live, and we give them the opportunity to choose it." Most intelligent beings, when presented with genuine alternatives, will choose cooperation over conflict. And those who don't? Those who insist on maintaining systems based on domination and exploitation are gradually isolated and contained. They become irrelevant as the rest of the galaxy moves toward more productive forms of organization. I spent weeks aboard the Harmony, learning about the Alliance's structure and philosophy, meeting with former enemies who had become cooperative partners, and slowly beginning to understand what the humans had offered to the galaxy. It wasn't just an alternative to the Kytherian Empire, it was a completely different way of thinking about civilization itself. But the question that haunted me throughout this period was whether I could personally make the same transition that Texaval and thousands of other Kytherian warriors had made. Could I abandon everything I had been taught about honor and glory and purpose? Could I find meaning in construction rather than destruction, in protection rather than conquest? The answer came to me during a conversation with a young human named Marcus Webb, a recent graduate of their diplomatic academy who was preparing for his first assignment to a newly liberated world. "What do you hope to accomplish there?" I asked him. His eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I want to help them rebuild their educational system. The Kytherian occupation destroyed most of their schools and universities, but they have an incredible intellectual tradition that just needs support to flourish again." "And that's enough for you? That's how you want to spend your life?" "Commander," he said, his voice filled with genuine passion, "there's no greater honor than helping an entire civilization rediscover its potential. I can't think of anything I'd rather do with my existence." In that moment, I finally understood what the humans were offering. They weren't asking us to become weak or to abandon our strength. They were asking us to use that strength in service of something larger and more meaningful than conquest. They were offering us the chance to become builders instead of destroyers, protectors instead of oppressors, teachers instead of tyrants. For the first time since my childhood, I felt something that had been absent from my life for so long that I had forgotten what it was like: hope. The decision to join the Alliance was the hardest choice of my life, but it was also the most liberating. After 3 weeks aboard the Harmony, I formally requested asylum and offered my services to help with the transition of other Kytherian worlds. Dr. Park arranged for me to work with Commander Texval on a special project, convincing the remaining Kytherian garrison forces to lay down their arms and join the growing wave of defections. My first assignment was perhaps the most challenging, returning to Kytherian Prime itself. The homeworld of our empire was in chaos when I arrived. The High Command was frantically trying to maintain control as reports of rebellions and defections poured in from across their territory. Civilian populations that had never questioned imperial authority were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the cost of their lifestyle. Most disturbingly for the leadership, many young Kytherians were openly expressing interest in the Alliance's philosophy of cooperation and mutual benefit. I was inserted onto the planet secretly, using human stealth technology that allowed me to avoid the increasingly paranoid security forces that now patrolled every major city. My contact was Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a human anthropologist who had spent years studying Kytherian culture and psychology in preparation for this moment. "The key," she explained as we met in a safe house deep beneath the capital city, "is to work with Kytherians who are already questioning the Empire's direction. We're not trying to convert true believers. We're trying to give alternatives to those who are already dissatisfied." "How many dissatisfied Kytherians are there?" I asked. "More than you might think. The constant warfare, the economic strain of maintaining garrisons on dozens of worlds, the growing isolation from galactic civilization, these factors have created significant unrest even among the core population." Over the following days, I began reaching out to former colleagues and subordinates, carefully testing their attitudes toward the Empire's current situation. What I found was both encouraging and heartbreaking. Many of the warriors I had served with were experiencing doubts and questions that they had never been allowed to express openly. "We've been fighting for so long," confided Warcast leader Dextal Vorman, an old friend who commanded one of the elite regiments stationed on Kytherian Prime. "But what are we fighting for anymore? What's the point of conquering new worlds if we can't even hold the ones we already have? What if there was another way?" I asked carefully. "What if there was a path that let you use your strength and skills without requiring endless warfare?" His crest's spines flared with interest. "Explain." So I told him about the Alliance, about former enemies working together to rebuild what had been destroyed, about Kytherian warriors finding purpose in construction and protection rather than conquest and domination, about civilizations flourishing when given the freedom to develop their own potential. "It sounds impossible," he said when I finished. "How can such different species work together without someone maintaining order through force?" "Because they want to work together," I explained. "When everyone benefits from cooperation, when everyone has a voice in making decisions, when everyone can see that they're part of something larger and better than what came before, force becomes unnecessary." The conversation continued for hours, with Dextal asking probing questions about everything from resource allocation to conflict resolution within the Alliance. I could see his military mind working through the implications, recognizing the logical advantages of a system based on willing cooperation rather than imposed submission. If this alliance is so superior, he finally asked, why did the humans wait so long to reveal themselves? Why didn't they contact us decades ago and offer this alternative? It was a question I had struggled with myself, and I gave him the answer that Admiral Chen had given me. Because we weren't ready to listen. The Empire was at the height of its power, confident in its superiority, convinced that conquest was the only viable path. We would have dismissed any alternative as weakness and continued our expansion until we eventually encountered something that could stop us. Like the humans. Like the humans. They recognize that sometimes people have to experience the consequences of their choices before they're willing to consider different ones. Word of my presence on Kytherian Prime eventually reached the High Command, and I was forced to go deeper underground to avoid capture. But by then, the ideas I was spreading had begun to take on a life of their own. Small groups of Kytherian civilians and military personnel were meeting secretly to discuss alternatives to the Empire's increasingly desperate situation. The breaking point came when High Marshal Vortak announced his intention to use the Empire's ultimate weapon, planet-killer devices, that would demonstrate Kytherian power by destroying the homeworlds of species that had joined the rebellion. The reaction was swift and decisive. A coalition of junior officers, led by Warcast Commander Zathal Morkai, who had apparently undergone his own crisis of conscience, arrested the High Marshal and announced that the Kytherian Empire was surrendering unconditionally. I watched the surrender ceremony from the human diplomatic vessel that had been sent to accept the Empire's capitulation. Admiral Chen stood beside me as we observed the formal transfer of authority from the Imperial government to a provisional council that would oversee the transition to Alliance membership. "How do you feel about this moment?" she asked me. "Sad and hopeful at the same time," I replied honestly. Sad for everything that was lost, all the destruction and suffering that didn't have to happen, but hopeful for what might be built in its place. "That's a healthy response," she said. "The past can't be changed, but the future is still unwritten." The months that followed were among the most challenging and rewarding of my life. As a member of the transition team, I worked with Alliance specialists to help former Kytherian worlds adapt to their new reality. The process was not always smooth. Generations of conditioning don't disappear overnight, but the progress was remarkable. On Vectel Prime, I saw the city that Tex Val had described, its completion even more beautiful than his words had suggested. Kytherian architects were working alongside Vectel artists to create structures that combined functionality with aesthetic beauty. while former warriors served as construction supervisors and safety coordinators. On Morden 7, a world that had been strip-mined to feed the Empire's war machine, I watched as human terraforming specialists worked with local populations to restore the planet's ecosystem. Former Kytherian engineers, their technical skills now directed toward healing rather than exploitation, were making crucial contributions to the environmental reconstruction. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when I returned to my own homeworld of Kytherian Prime. The capital city, once a monument to military power and imperial glory, was being transformed into something unprecedented, a center of learning and cultural exchange, where beings from dozens of species could come to study and share knowledge. I was assigned to help establish the new military academy, an institution dedicated to teaching the principles of defensive warfare and conflict resolution. Young Kytherians who might once have become conquerors were now learning to become protectors, their natural strength and aggression channeled into safeguarding the peace and security of Alliance worlds. "Do you miss the old days?" asked one of my first students, a young warrior whose crest spines showed the genetic markers of the most elite bloodlines. "I miss the certainty," I admitted. "The old system was simple. We were strong, others were weak, and strength determined everything. The new system is more complex, requiring us to think about consequences and alternatives and the welfare of others." "Is it better, though?" I considered the question carefully. "Let me ask you something in return. Would you rather spend your life destroying things that other beings have built, or building things that will last for generations?" The student thought for a moment. "Building, I think. Destruction is easier, but construction feels more meaningful. Then, you understand why the new system is better. It's not easier. In many ways, it's much harder than what we used to do, but it's more meaningful, more fulfilling, and it creates something lasting instead of just leaving ashes behind." As I settled into my new role as an educator and counselor, I often reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The humans had indeed been a nightmare for the Kytherian Empire, but they had been a nightmare in the way that waking up is a nightmare for someone trapped in a pleasant dream. They had forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our impact on the galaxy. But the humans had also offered us something that no enemy had ever provided before: redemption. They had shown us that we could choose to be different, that our strength could serve purposes greater than conquest, that our civilization could contribute to galactic progress instead of hindering it. 3 years after the Empire's surrender, I received an invitation that would have been unimaginable during my military career. The Alliance was establishing its first joint colony, a world where beings from 100 different species would work together to create a completely new form of civilization. They wanted me to serve as the colony's security coordinator, using my experience and knowledge to help protect this unprecedented experiment in cooperative living. As I prepared to accept this assignment, I realized that the humans had given me something even more valuable than redemption. They had given me a future worth living for. Instead of endless cycles of conquest and violence, I now faced the prospect of helping to build something genuinely new in galactic history. The memory extraction session was finally complete. As the neural probes withdrew from my skull, I saw the faces of the Kytherian intelligence officers who had been recording my experiences. They looked shaken, disturbed by what they had learned about humanity and the Alliance. "Is it true?" asked the lead interrogator. "Are the humans really offering us partnership instead of subjugation?" "Everything I've told you is true," I replied. "But the offer won't remain open indefinitely. The Alliance is patient, but they're not infinitely patient. Eventually, they'll conclude that we're too committed to the old ways to change, and they'll move on without us. And if we refuse their offer..." I thought about the words Admiral Chen had spoken during our first encounter, the calm certainty in her voice when she had described the fate of empires that refuse to evolve. "Then we'll become a historical footnote," I said. "A civilization that had the opportunity to be part of something greater than itself, but chose extinction instead of transformation." As I was led back to my cell, I couldn't help but wonder whether my testimony would make any difference. The Kytherian High Command was desperate and proud, not a combination that typically led to wise decisions. But perhaps there were enough individuals like Texval and Dextal, beings who could see past their conditioning to recognize a better path when it was offered to them. The humans had taught me many things during my time with the Alliance, but perhaps the most important lesson was this. Every individual has the power to choose what kind of future they want to help create. The old Kytherian Empire offered only one choice: conquest or extinction. The Alliance offered something far more valuable: the chance to become something better than what we had been. Whether my people would have the wisdom to take that chance remained to be seen. But I had made my choice, and I would live with the consequences, whatever they might be. The nightmare of facing humanity had ended. The dream of working with them was just beginning.